You have heard the number. In the past, life expectancy was about 30. People were old at 35 and dead at 40. It gets repeated constantly, and it is technically true, and it is one of the most misleading statistics anybody has ever produced. Here's the trick hiding inside it. Life expectancy at birth is an average. Averages are brutally sensitive to what happens at the extremes. So imagine a group where half the babies born die before their 5th birthday, and everybody who makes it past that lives to 70. Do the arithmetic, and the average life expectancy at birth comes out somewhere around 35. And yet in that group, nobody dies at 35. There is no such person. Every single individual either dies as a small child or lives to be old. That is roughly what ancient human life actually looked like. The infant and child death rate was catastrophic by our standards. In studies of modern foraging and forager farming groups, something like a quarter of children die in the first year of life, and often around 40% do not reach 15. Every one of those deaths pulls the average down hard. So the useful question is not how long people lived. It is how long people lived given that they survived childhood. And we have an answer to that because two anthropologists, Gurven and Hillard Kaplan, went and assembled the data. They pulled together demographic records from foraging groups across the world, the Hadza in Tanzania, the Ache in Paraguay, the Jew hoansi in the Kalahari, the Tsimane in Bolivia, and looked at what happens to people who make it out of childhood. The result is not 30. If you reached 15, your most likely age at death was somewhere in the late 60s to the late 70s. Not your maximum. Your most likely. The typical adult death in a society with no medicine, no surgery, no antibiotics was an old person in their 70s. Read that again because it inverts the whole picture. Old age is not a modern invention. Surviving childhood is the modern invention. Now, how confident can we be about this deeper in the past? Here I have to be honest about a real problem. Aging a skeleton is difficult, and it gets much less reliable the older the person was. Archaeologists estimate age from things like tooth wear, the surfaces of the pelvis where bones meet, and the fusion of joints. Those methods work reasonably well on a 20-year-old. Past about 50, they compress everything together, and a 75-year-old and a 55-year-old can look similar, which means skeletal samples have historically tended to undercount the very old. But there is one study that got around the problem in a clever way, and it is one of my favorite pieces of archaeology. In 2004, Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee did not try to work out exact ages at all. Instead, they used a ratio. For a large set of fossil human teeth, they sorted individuals into two rough groups, young adults and adults old enough to be grandparents, and asked simply how many old ones there were for every young one. Across earlier hominins, the ratio stays low. Then, in the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 30,000 years ago, it jumps. Dramatically. Suddenly, there are far more older adults in the population than before. That is the moment grandparents became common. Not the moment somebody first reached 60, but the moment it stopped being unusual, and 3 generations could be alive at the same time. And that changes what a society can be because of what an old person actually is in a world with no writing. An old person is a library. Think about what that means concretely. There is a drought that happens roughly once every 60 years. Everybody under 50 has never seen one, does not know the signs, and does not know where the water still runs when the river fails. One person in the group does, because she was a child the last time it happened. She is the only copy of that information in existence. In a world without writing, knowledge does not accumulate in books. It accumulates in people who lived long enough to see rare things. There is a related idea called the grandmother hypothesis, developed by Kristen Hawkes partly from watching Hadza women in Tanzania. She noticed that older women were among the hardest working foragers in the camp, digging tubers not for themselves, but effectively feeding grandchildren, which allows their daughters to have the next baby sooner. That may help explain something genuinely strange about our species. Human females stop reproducing decades before they die. Almost no mammal does that. If old age were useless, evolution should not have built a long post-reproductive life at all. And we can see care for the old directly in the bones. There is a famous Neanderthal skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, an individual who had lost most of his teeth long before death, with the jawbone reshaped where the sockets had closed over, and severe arthritis. He kept living. Somebody was helping him eat. There is another from Shanidar in Iraq, with a withered arm, healed fractures and damage that probably blinded him in one eye. He survived those injuries by years. Whatever else Neanderthals were, they did not abandon their old. I do not want to romanticize it. Being old back then was hard in ways that are difficult to imagine. Joints ground down by decades of walking and carrying. Teeth worn to the roots by grit in the food. Old fractures that healed crooked. There was no way to fix your eyes and no way to fix your hip. But there is one strange counterweight. Studies of the Tsimane in Bolivia, who live physically hard, high-activity lives with very little processed food, found some of the lowest rates of coronary artery disease ever measured in any population. Their arteries at 80 resemble those of much younger people in industrialized countries. So the picture we end up with is nothing like the cartoon. The ancient world was not full of people dying at 30. It was full of children who did not survive, and adults who, having survived, often kept going into their 70s. Some of them with no teeth, most of them in pain, and all of them carrying the only copy of what the group knew. Old age was not rare. It was just extremely hard to qualify for.